both our speakers have written in the newsroom of the USB, so you're welcome to go on the USB website, usb.ac.za, and just click on the newsroom section. You'll see that both their articles are there. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our speakers today. So Seraj Toefy and Jason Hamilton are our speakers for today. Seraj is a serial entrepreneur based in Cape Town with a rich background in marketing, communication, and entrepreneurship. He is also the custodian of entrepreneurship at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Seraj, maybe as soon as I've introduced you, you can just tell us a bit more about what that means. What does a custodian of entrepreneurship mean? And he lectures in entrepreneurial strategy and management at a few leading universities throughout Africa. And he's also a regular speaker on the topic in Europe. Then he is also the CEO of Ukandlu Holdings, which consists of Bespoke Media, Centura Global Africa, ClickTech, Crest Science, and Ukondla Consulting. So Seraj will be speaking to us today. And then our other speaker for this morning or for this afternoon is Jason Hamilton. Jason is a director at First River Capital. He has over 15 years of experience in banking and the financial services sector, where he focused on corporate finance, project finance, and leverage on acquisition finance. So very well versed in the financial side of things. He is also a guest lecturer on USB's development finance program. He presents on capital raising for public and private projects, which I think is very relevant at this point in time. He also guest lectures on the USB's MBA on corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, and funding strategies. Then he also forms part of the USB Executive Development faculty. They're the Executive Development Training Facility at the USB. And he's a facilitator for USB's International Affairs Program, quite a busy man. He has been appointed to the Thought Leadership and Business Ethics Committee of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants and Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, starting on the 1st of June 2020. So gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks.
So if I may, can I kick off with a few questions? And if I can start with Jason. Jason, the pandemic has placed the economy and business under very severe pressure. We have seen government react through various stimulus packages being announced recently, and the recovery plan is announced. What do you think is the outlook for our economy, and will we be able to recover from the shock? Maybe a bit of an unfair question, but you could try your hand at answering that.
Sure, thank you for the opportunity. I think it's important. It's a very important question because obviously it drives a lot of things going forward about what the recovery looks like, but also what our growth plan looks like for the next 3 to 6 years. And obviously, I'm going to try not to repeat what we all can kind of read in the press, but I do think there's a few points that I think around this that when we do get asked this question, we need to keep in mind for our planning from a government and from a company point of view. I think the first thing that's prevalent to remember is that prior to the crisis hitting, the global economy, so the US, Europe, was already was having trouble from a GDP growth point of view and from a PMI point of view. So the pressure globally has also been there to see returns. And then from a South African point of view, as we know, we've had a very, very difficult, let's call it 8-year cycle, or at least the last 3 years, a very difficult cycle from a growth point of view as well. So when people talk about we want the new normal, from a global point of view, if we emerge from this and when we emerge from this, we in any case emerging into a very difficult environment, even pre the crisis. So I think that context is interesting to also understand. But then the positive side of that is that the globe is also united through that, and that we are emerging, we're all in this actually together. I think from a South African perspective, we mentioned GDP growth globally being under pressure, and we've seen that obviously locally as well. And that data about how big the contraction will be literally over the last 3 weeks has probably changed about, I think, 4 times, depending on which sources you look at. And obviously the prognosis doesn't look that great. So even when I wrote sort of 3 weeks about this, we were looking at, in my view, about a 5% contraction. And now I think the consensus is 6% to even 8%. That being said, if the last 3 weeks we've seen this move, where could, depending on what the recovery looks like, where does that actually end? I think the end result though is that we're dealing with so in February, we were looking at a deficit of about 7% of GDP. and that now significantly obviously will increase. So I think again around there also the consensus is that that's going to be probably double. We're seeing Moody's and S&P now saying around a 14-15% deficit, and that's just in this year, which makes it a close to an 800 billion rand hole that we need to fill, which is also why we've seen government come to the fore with the various stimulus packages they have announced. For me, however, we're sitting with also the impact from that with already very high levels of debt within government. And again, this is also quite known. But again, that trajectory we were on was for roughly from February going forward, things stabilizing in about a 3-year period. So in 3 years' time, we would have seen things starting to look better. Now we've got this dip taking place, which means we are definitely on a different path. How deep that hole is probably a little bit early to actually say, but the point remains that when we do start recovering, the timeline of that at the bare minimum is a 3-year timeline. If we just look at what we were dealing with pre-going into the crisis. So it's very possible that that 3-year cycle before things start stabilizing could be a 4 or 5-year cycle, depending on the decisions we make now. I think, however, when we do say that, and again, I'm not going to repeat stats sort of we read in the papers, but kind of we know that deficit will be higher, we know debt levels will be higher, probably in 2023 sitting with about a 90% debt level compared to GDP, and that again, depending on what happens now and how big the dip is, could even be more. For me, I guess the slight silver lining is that the pandemic has proven to us how the global economy and how interconnected the global economy really is, specifically from the emerging market point of view in relation to the developed economies. And I think around that, we have seen that focus also. I know people are running away from emerging economies now, but there's also that resurgence before this around focusing on emerging economies. And this has now proven how interconnected we are, how important the supply chains are, and even the developed economies. If something in emerging economies is struggling, it can't be ignored. So I think there's definitely a galvanizing effect around that. Although everybody's taking a very sort of isolated view now, I think when we start to talk about recovery, the next 6 months, the next 12 months, and then we're talking 3 years, we will see probably a very different global economy from a relationship we are also emerging from this.
Great, thanks, Jason. I think overall, probably not the best news, but we are living in interesting times. So, and I know that from a futures perspective, we always say every risk has an opportunity. And that's probably, I think, our challenge is to try and see where those opportunities lie. But Seraj, maybe you'd like to add on to the question that I've asked Jason, but also maybe how has this affected small business, the lockdown itself? Because a lot of people haven't been able to work, therefore they won't be able to invoice or get money for work that have been completed. So what would be your suggestions and what would you suggest and say?
Yeah, thanks, Helette. Wow, it really is unprecedented. I know a lot of people, the word is used a lot, but I've been asked recently, what can we draw on and kind of learn from the past on the situations that we're dealing with. But there's no case study to look at anything like this before, right? And the kind of things Jason was saying was just, it's so global and it's so interconnected that we really are feeling the pinch all the way down. And I mean, it's very telling that we're at the end of a 5-week lockdown for small businesses. And I really do feel like a lot of small businesses have I know it's obvious, but they've changed we all start businesses hoping that it'll grow, hoping that we can be more prosperous. The last 5 weeks has just all been about survival. And for a small business, that really is what it has been about. It's about, how do I survive this so that when we come out of it, I still have enough money from a working capital point of view to deliver on work that might actually come out, because what I'm finding with a lot of businesses that I work with a lot of small SMEs, they're using all their reserves, all their savings just to stay alive for the 5 weeks. So we're looking at how we're going to bounce back. And I do think you know, Jason was talking about the global economy and how it might recover. I think there's going to be a bounce back quite quickly, as there's going to be a lot of spend initially, or there needs to be a lot of spend as well. But the problem with small businesses is that they're going to struggle to actually fulfill those orders because most of their money has been used up from a cash flow perspective. So it has been exceptionally hard for small business. What small businesses have needed to do right now is try and reduce their costs. And I know that this sounds really obvious, but we needed to reduce costs down to the absolute bare minimum. And with that, it can kind of expand and give yourself a runway. So small businesses are always looking at how long is my runway when it comes to I can survive. When is the next bit of money coming in? It's all about cash flow. I'm probably going to butcher this quote, but you know, we talk about revenue being vanity, turnover being vanity, profit being profit being sanity, and cash flow being reality. And that's really what it's about. It really comes down to, it's about managing the cash flow. Because if you don't do that, you're actually not going to be able to pick yourself up when it is there. But from a global perspective, I think, you know, what we really need is that the entire economy, as most of us will know this, is an interconnected cog of things. And the money and finances keeps this cog moving all along. The money flows in one area, it moves these cogs as you went along. When we dipped in the past, we've been dipping in particular countries, we've been dipping in particular sectors. Never before has the entire globe shut down in the way it has. And what has happened is all these cogs have now just basically stopped moving. You'll probably find those of us that are privileged enough to have money have kind of sat around going, yo, I've spent so little during this lockdown. That's both a good thing and a bad thing, because we actually need people to spend now. We need people to come out and buy things so that that trickle-down effect can start happening again, and these cogs can start turning and we can start going. So yeah, I mean, I know I've rambled on a little bit, but it's been a tough 5 weeks, and I know we're only moving to level 4 tomorrow, but it's an important step to opening up the economy again, and a vital one. I do not think small business could extend right now. Whether we from an actual health perspective need to lock down again, I hope not. But to not open now would have been a crucial mistake.
Thanks, Seraj. And I know that we've had an interview with Prof. Andre Roux that's also on the newsroom, and he says that we're not going back to business as usual. We really have to just embrace the business unusual, and we really need to dig deep and find ways of changing things, because we cannot go back to what we were. So Jason, if I can move on to you, what should companies be focusing on? I think that's a question that people are asking that can assist them from now on. What would be those core things that you could point out if you can be so bold? Because we need to try.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a question obviously we're all facing, and I guess as Seraj also indicated, there's various sectors of the economy, and each will obviously have a different approach. And I think also there's an element to this that if we're having this debate, there's a luxury to you that if you're on starving, your reactions will be quite different, that you can plan for the future, where if you have to focus short term and focus on the tomorrow, that'll also change your perspective. But I think the important thing to note is that we're dealing with a health crisis, which obviously has a financial impact, but we're not quite dealing with a financial crisis. However, that could easily be the knock-on effect if things aren't managed now in the short term, which is why we've seen the stimulus come on board from government. But again, if that doesn't get managed right, if you don't manage the next sort of 3 years of recovery out of this, it could very well lead to a financial crisis. Companies need to, although we're probably still in the midst of what we could term some level of recovery where we start opening up, we're still in the midst of dealing with this crisis and probably the short-term impact of what we have seen happen. But we also need to then start lifting our head and start looking forward and say, well, are we going to, so if we do survive, how are we going to then start to rebuild, and how are we going to start growing? And I think we've seen government, I think, say a very similar thing as well when they're starting to look forward. For me, from a company point of view, when this crisis hit, one of the things that we ourselves did, what we saw some of our clients do, and what we just saw in the market, is that I think a lot of businesses, if you look at your corporate governance structures, have systems and processes in place to, I think, manage and identify risks. And I think going back to that is obviously a core thing to do, is to say, well, let's go back to what we actually have from a governance point of view, which continuously scans the market for risks, for new risks, and then manages that accordingly. Obviously, the frequency of that now should increase. So if you had a governance structure, if you had a board meeting once a month, you're probably going to have board meetings once a week. If you have risk committee meetings, you probably set up a special structure for that more frequent information can start feeding into that. And it's not only just financial. I mean, I think we do talk about cash flow, that is obviously crucial, but there's a lot of other factors linked to stakeholders, which also needs to be considered. And this is where your governance structure becomes so important from a stakeholder engagement point of view. And if we take it more practical, stakeholder engagement ultimately comes down to looking at your supply chain and trying to keep that as alive as possible. So yes, we've seen organizations focus on having short-term cash flow to survive. We've seen them focus on their employees, as they should, because we don't want that to also spill over into the economy. But then it also comes down to engaging with your supply chain, value chain, and making sure that that stays as alive during this crisis, that when you do start scaling again, or can start scaling, we've got actually something to start trading back into. And again, I think that mechanism of using your governance structures and whatever systems you've got is so important. Obviously, we'll see less of that play out in the SME world, but I think in the SME world, it also highlights how important it is to have the right control structures in place, because it gives you the groundwork to actually build from. I think also something important, I've been hearing a lot of people talking in the media, companies talking about pivoting. Now, I think pivoting in the true sense is probably not something a business should be looking at right now. However, you should be looking at tweaking. You should be looking at your business model, your operating model, and seeing what adjustments can be made to still remain viable in the short term, but then obviously again for the growth. And what we mean by that, it could be mixing your product differently, it could be tweaking your pricing, etc. And we've seen a very simple example is, for example, let's say your sit-down restaurants now opening up again, being able to deliver food boxes pre-prepped, or then frozen meals, etc., which is that tweak. Pivoting, I think, could be a little bit dangerous in that we're not quite sure what we're actually dealing with yet. I think as more information comes on board, you might want to start pivoting, but I think there's a danger in that. So I think tweaking is important. And I think finance, obviously, as I mentioned, is something crucial. So finance, and again, there's a luxury to this, but companies should be taking a 12 to 24 month view here. I don't think, yes, we have to survive short term, but I think it's also looking at longer term and say, well, how does the next 12 to 24 months potentially for me look, and how can we adjust that? There's some short-term things companies can do. So I think to get around that, having the right financial forecast, really looking at that on a pretty much a daily basis is probably what is required, how fast the things are changing, and making sure that gets fed back into, obviously, the business systems to the right people at the right decision-making level to then adjust whatever they need to adjust. Internal finance, so there is some internal restructuring that can be done potentially to free up money, meaning how you actually work your organization. Accessing funding through known channels. So I think, again, banks is important for that. And we've seen also stimulus provided through that, through government, by making funding available through existing channels. And then the equity providers. As Seraj also mentioned, the SMEs are looking to their shareholders again to recapitalize the business, and the larger companies are having to do the same thing. They potentially have the luxury of the capital markets to look to, but that's where they're looking. I think if you're now in the position to engage a new funder, or you're engaging a new potential shareholder or investor, it is very difficult, probably impossible. One, they've got their own commitments to probably do and help their portfolio companies. But in this lockdown, just to do the relevant due diligence is pretty much impossible because you can't actually get access. So I think there's an element there too, which assists or makes the short-term pressure worse. But we will also see that change. I think as we start opening up, we will see the activity also picking up. And I think for me, companies also, from a financial point, again, if you're looking at your budgeting, your forecasting, your scenario planning, contingency planning, having all these scenarios feed through is important. And it's important when you're raising finance as well. So I think the first thing a funder will ask you is, what do you need and why? And then as long as you're in that position to answer that, no matter how bleak it looks, I think it already puts you on the forward foot when you actually are engaging.
Thanks, Jason. I think if I can just reflect back to what I hear from you. Oh, sure. No, so I was just going to say, and then I'll hand over to you, Seraj, is that what I hear is that we're looking for certainty. So from a company point of view, it's finding those places of certainty where governance could potentially help you to find that certainty. Also not reacting. So not just pivoting all of a sudden, but kind of seeing how you can tweak what exists. But also it's a possibility to take stock, to really take stock of your supply chain, to see what can be tightened up and what can be improved and what can be changed. And then the long-term view, that although we are in a survival mode, and I think people do go to the negative always, it is about what's happening to the next 12 to 24 months. So sorry, Seraj, but you're welcome to also add to what Jason was saying. And also, from your point of view, can you say what will happen now?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on a similar kind of the same question, just to give the perspective of the entrepreneur, because one of the and really great points Jason made, and one of them, he said that businesses should take a 12 to 24 month kind of view. The reality is that an entrepreneur doesn't have that luxury. An entrepreneur, and there's research done in London on small businesses, there is that most small businesses have cash flow for the next 27 days. Now, the lockdown has been longer than that. And that's really the cold face when it comes to a small business, is the luxury is slightly different than the emphasis. But in general, I think we need to do the same kind of things, which is look at the business model. With a small business, you often don't have time to work on your business because you're working in your business. You're just so busy working in your business, hustling all the time and trying to keep alive, that you don't have the luxury to sit down and kind of look at the business and say, are my processes in place? Because only processes can really be scaled. So what can I do about documenting the processes? How do I do process flows? How do I look at my business model? Do a business model canvas if you have to, but look at this business model and say, where am I? Am I still core to what I want to be doing? Now, the thing is with a small business, a lot of small businesses started working from home. And then as things grew, they kind of got an office or a factory. Then they employed some staff, and they just got fatter and fatter as the good times went. So what this is doing is it's forcing us all to go back to those old bootstrapping days where we worked from home. Guess what? We've done it before, we can do it again. And it is an opportunity to rebuild. It's an opportunity to look at your business and say, are there certain areas of my business that are just not as profitable, they're not delivering the kind of thing? Am I focusing on things that are not feeding me both financially and my soul? What can I redo? And this is where Jason was talking about the pivoting. Being agile is not a strategy. Being agile is an ability that you have as an entrepreneur, but that ability needs to be used within a framework of a strategy. So you have to kind of look at this now and go, yes, I need to be agile and I need to be able to pivot, but let's do it within a framework of a strategy. So I do say a little bit of time that we do have on our hands is to look inward. The other thing is communication with your suppliers, communication with your clients, communication with your staff is vitally important, because just going silent on people is not the way to do that, especially if you're going to get into, even if you aren't, but just to maintain that relationship so that when everything opens up again, people remember you, aware of you, and you're still in their good books. So keep that kind of thing going. And then last thing I want to mention at this stage is that an entrepreneur's biggest asset is themselves. They are the number one asset. You might have come up with a cool widget or a new cool piece of tech, but it often is built on the back of that business person. And so in the lockdown, can you develop yourself a little bit more, read more, just use the time to study, get a short course online. There's lots of short courses online. Learn a skill, try and improve so that you actually come out of this stronger than we went in. And I know that that's kind of could sound a bit rah-rah out there. It's like, oh, you know, but we have to consider that we want to thrive out of this, not just survive. And that's really where that's what we need to be focusing on now.
I think, Seraj, I just want to pick up on a point you mentioned there around and I know this contentious point is always there between, let's say, listed and big corporate and SME and then your informal sector. And I think this is exactly the point that we're both probably trying to make is one, how interconnected things are. So corporate, yes, they've got the luxury probably with different capital structures, cash reserves, etc., to be able to look forward and plan 12 months. However, if they go look at their stakeholders, a lot of that's going to, or their supply chains, a lot of that will probably be linked to either on the offtake side or on the supply side to SMEs and potentially even the informal sector. And that's where the pain is being felt because they don't have that luxury. And I think for corporates to look at that and also see where they can assist, let's call it down or upstream, is obviously crucial because they've got that capability. We talk about the informal sector, which is probably even in a worse position than any SME out there. And it's a significant sector, being roughly about 5% of GDP is the estimate. So it's a significant sector to look at. And how is that sector surviving through this period where there might not even be bank accounts in existence? So I think there's a lot of things being highlighted through this pandemic, which I think if you go into the academia and the history, a lot of people have mentioned, but I think it hasn't really resonated with many people. I think this pandemic has highlighted once that interconnection, and also the fact that these problems are real and it is actually impacting everyone. So I think we'll see a very different, hopefully a very different corporate culture also, I think, come out of this if you actually go back to those bases and see, well, who am I actually relying on?
So thank you for that, Jason. You've kind of gone into my next question. Seraj, maybe you can start with this one. So which industries do you guys think will be lagging in the recovery the most?
Yeah, I think any industry where people need to gather in more than one place, you know, like gyms, tourism, the eventing industry, sports events and stadium, and yeah, anywhere that you need to kind of gather in a physical form. And I know that we often talk about the new norm going forward, and there is going to be a new norm. And I think in some respects that we mustn't shy away from that. I think we need to kind of look at this and go, is this an opportunity to kind of self-check ourselves as a globe, as an entire globe, and say what is the new norm? So I think the industries, those are some of the big industries: eventing, tourism, sports, anything where you gather. But the difficulty, and it's exactly what Jason had said, is that when you look at one industry like that, everything else kind of just ripples off that. So the fact that I recently read that the convention center is now Cape Town Convention Center is being turned into a hospital, 800 beds. Fantastic, good use, nice pivot during this time, because live events are just not going to happen. So you kind of go, okay, that means the CTICC, it's a government institution anyway, but they're going to get some revenue in there because they're now a hospital. But what about all the suppliers to those events, whether it's the stand builders, the printers, the promotional workers, the media that falls off that, the transport sector, everything. So that ripple effect just runs all the way through. So yeah, those are, for me, those are the main areas that might be affected. I think I didn't mention the airlines, but I think the airlines have taken a massive knock, and with their kind of their high cost base, there's some, yeah, not all airlines will survive. That's for sure.
And Jason, from your side, anybody else that you think, any other industries that you think you could mention? Also, just to mention, we are going on a game drive every day, so I think the whole tourism industry is changing substantially, and my kids absolutely love it. But anyway,
I think there's a few interesting things like that's come to the fore, and I kind of think to myself, why haven't, or maybe these things were there, we just weren't looking for it. So I think, again, we're talking about this pivoting or adjusting. I think there's a couple of companies out there who've taken advantage of the position we're in, and I think also, and I think I mentioned this in a few other interviews, what's insightful for me is if I look at all the creatives around the globe, with them all stuck in the house now, they're all creating, they're all still creating and putting it out there, and obviously for free as well. But I find that same creativity still coming through even in just normal individuals. So yes, you've got some famous singer now playing with the guitar singing, but then I've also got my neighbor doing the same thing. So I think it's interesting for me also from a culture point of view, what we revert back to, and again, how similar we all actually are. So that was a key takeaway for me. Yes, I think industries under pressure, I think that knock-on effect is significant. And I'm worried about probably next year, because I think there's going to be companies that survive now, that's able to draw on cash reserves, etc., that's able to maybe access, well, not necessarily cheap funding, but with government guarantee coming in to maybe access short-term finance. But again, how this recovery looks like, how we bounce back, how the global economy bounce back, will affect what that looks like. So I think there is, let's call it optimism now about opening up again, and we will see some recovery. But I think across the board, we're going to be surprised where we do see pain being felt. Now, using Edcons are probably the fair example, because they were probably in trouble before. But there's someone who's big, who's got access to the capital markets, and who's now very, very deep in trouble. Now, again, as I said, they were in trouble before. So, but those things will start playing out. And I think we're going to see a few household names disappear or change. I think also, if you look at restaurants, I think we'll be very surprised when we are able to go back out and things functioning, what we can refer to as some level of normal. There is going to be a lot that won't open. I think the reality is businesses will close. Not everybody will survive this. And I think I would look at the stats again, but I think when this comes from government directly, I think they estimated between 1,500 and 2,000 businesses not making it. I'm assuming that would have moved already if I look at how data has changed over the last 3 weeks. But that's the reality we're going to sit with. There are companies that aren't going to make it. And that fallout will be big. We hope that in time, the people and the supply chains can be replaced with competitors, etc. But we're not going to come out of this with no bruises or with no cuts. We're going to see blood, which is a very unfortunate position to be in. And again, the fact that I can sit here talking about that, you also have to be aware that we're doing that from a very privileged position, many of us and many companies. It's very different if you're going hungry and you can't eat tomorrow to lift your head and start thinking about the future. I think companies must understand that too. There's an empathy part to this too, which I guess has also come to the fore, because we've moved, I think people have stopped looking at economics and they've looked at the people factor to a big degree. And I think this, as we mentioned earlier, about the health impact. We're dealing with a health crisis. Finances has been pushed to the wayside. We're looking at what do we need to do to save lives. And then the thing comes, now we've done that, how do we now deal with the economic implication of it?
Jason, I think you hit it on the head there at the end, in that I also saw those stats where it came from Stats SA that it was a bit of research done in the first part of the lockdown where it asked how many companies feel that they will survive this, and 4 out of 6 said they probably won't. The reality on that is that even a company that's going to survive has probably needed to put their weekly staff and stop paying them completely. So the company is going to survive because the owner has a deeper pockets and they can cut all their expenses. And that means weekly staff that just have zero income. And so this pandemic and the crisis has very quickly gone from a health crisis to an economic one. Yeah. And I understand that it's not a financial crisis in a kind of scale, or I think it's an economic crisis at the moment, in that you've got people that are in townships going, I will take my chances on that I'll survive the COVID-19 strain, but I won't survive not eating, you know. And it's really it's unfortunately it has highlighted this big divide that we have between the haves and the have-nots. We're already the country with the highest Gini coefficient in the world. And all it's doing is it's highlighting that, because we can sit here on a webinar, we can sit here and do homeschooling. My domestic servant who's at home and her daughter's in matric, I phoned her yesterday to see how she is and everything else. And her matric daughter, they've got no access to a computer, no access to internet. So she just has her study books and that's what she's going. Yet she'll have to write the exam at the same time as everyone else and compete against everyone else. So yeah, it's just such a multifaceted problem that we're dealing with. And I've been thinking about it recently, that for the academics in this world, there's going to be terabytes and terabytes of data that we can all go and kind of scrummage through for the next couple of years when it comes to data on how the economy was affected, how leadership was affected, how health, all of these things. We'll be writing kind of research papers and PhDs on this stuff for years to come.
Thanks, guys. We're going on a very negative slant here, which I think is unfortunately the reality. And it's a very complex situation. This is a very complex situation. And I think the things that stand out for me is that we need to realize that the generosity of the human spirit needs to step up in some way, whether it is to give someone data, whether it is to give access to a phone, whether it is to continue paying your domestic, even though they might not be physically at work. We need to find ways, in creative, generous ways, because as you've indicated on both ends, the supply chain will be affected on all sorts of levels. I was watching some documentary or a short clip called Some Good News by an American actor. And they are actually you can buy some credits from restaurants. So you can actually, like you buy cards from Woolworths, you buy like a credit card from Woolworths. They're doing that in the short term to help restaurants stay open so that they can then later redeem their meal, if so be. But creativity is something that we're going to have to come up with some creative solutions. But let's go into a bit.
Yes? Let me help with that. In that, there's definitely good stories, and just very quick one in Cape Town, in Hout Bay, the Hout Bay community is rallying around. They've started a fund where the elite are kind of donating money and services and everything else to help out the township that's their EY, and they're really doing amazingly well. And we could spend an entire webinar, hour and a half, talking about the good. I'm sorry that we took it on that turn, but there's definitely going to be a lot of positive things that come out of this. And just one quick thing is that, just like you said, where you can buy the vouchers for restaurants or a haircut, because we all need haircuts and we're going to need it soon, but the hairdressers need those vouchers. So kind of help out your local. We're doing it here in South Africa as well. But there's also opportunities for innovation in this time. In the last downturn in 2008, the financial downturn, that's when Uber, that's when Pinterest, that's when a lot of big companies, Airbnb, they were all established in the downturn. And I think that looking back in a few years' time, we'll look at this and go, look at these big companies that were kind of created during this time. I think there will be opportunities within this.
And I fully agree with you. And I think the reason for me taking it to a different angle is that mankind can so easily get stuck in the dystopia. And we must also realize that there is a utopia as well, and we have a choice. So on that note, Jason, if I can pick on you, coming from the financial side and investment and equity, private equity firms, how has the investment community responded in your opinion? And is it enough?
I think it's never enough. And I think that's the point with government as well, that we need to sort of borrow our way out of this, although the investment side is also important. So I think it's a very interesting one to look at. I think it's good that we're able to share some feedback we've got from some of the local private equity firms and investors, but then also I've added I'm going to add some international perspective as well with some of the private equity firm feedback we've had from some of the private equity firms in Europe and America as well. I think one that I want to always, when I start off with this, is we always view investors and shareholders a lot of times, especially when they're big institutions, as the big bad shareholder and they're hungry for dividends, etc. But I think we also have to remember the other side of this, that most investors are the custodians of your money. They're ultimately managing pensions, funding for NGOs, charities, university endowments. So there is really no big bad investor. It's actually you ultimately as the pensioner. So I think that context is important. So when somebody can't invest because they've got, or they want a dividend because they have to look after the pension obligation, that's why they need to suck out the money. On the flip side, that's why they also can't take undue risk and just invest for the sake of investing, because there's an obligation on them on what they need to do with it. Now, there's caveats to that, obviously, but I think that's just something I always start with when we talk about investors, in that it's not necessarily some wealthy individual necessarily, it's actually our money. I think what we have seen is that obviously there's a big internal focus. So all the funds is looking one after the health of their fund. A lot of funds, specifically overseas, have started using leverage as well. So debt has the implication on them too. So they've taken a fund focus first to say, are we healthy? What does our obligations for the next 12, 24, 36 months look like? And are we structured? The second focus they do is to look at obviously portfolio companies. So say, well, we are shareholders in the portfolio company. We need to assist where we can to make sure that that company remains healthy. So where that does help, normally private equity is relatively hands-off. Here we've got expertise now offering and jumping into portfolio companies to assist in these times. That might not be with funding, but although it could be, but it's also with time and re-looking at financial models, seeing where the business need to pivot or where they need to adjust, etc. So I think that focus is important. And I think to Seraj's point that he mentioned earlier as well, this focusing on the core business is something obviously coming to the fore, which is something everybody does in any crisis. You say, let's focus on our core business and then build from there or position ourselves from there. A lot of questions we also get asked or debates being held is around new transactions, new money. I think the reality is that investors will probably be very reluctant to make new investments in the short term for various reasons. One, they've got their portfolio companies and that obligation to look at. But again, as I mentioned a bit earlier, if you're assessing a new transaction or a new investment, to be able to do the right level of due diligence, you need access to information and you need access to the company in a large degree. So during this lockdown, that's not really possible. Although we have seen a lot of funds announce transactions taking place, but in most cases, they've been with either companies who has been through some sort of interaction, meaning it's a known entity, or it's been a business that they've been engaging with prior to the pandemic hitting and now still investing. That being said, I think as we start going over from June to end of the year and beyond, I think we will see a very active investment community, private equity, and even VC community, in that there will be and there is investment opportunities to be had. One, purely from a return point of view, but then also from a portfolio company point of view, where there's opportunities to do mergers and acquisitions, buy up competitors, put companies together, etc. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean, I know there's a lot of noise coming out of the US from, you get vulture funds which sort of prey on companies that go under. I think we don't have to go as sinister as that. I just think that there's, from a sustainability point of view, there will be opportunities where two competitors will say, well, if we put ourselves together, we're going to be stronger to actually face the world going forward. So I think that's something which, from an investor point of view, I think we should see a lot of activity over the rest of the year, into next year and even the year beyond, I think being quite healthy. I think also it's important to note that, and I'm just going to talk private equity now, without any new funds being raised, there's roughly about 30 billion rand of committed capital available waiting to be deployed. So now again, we're talking about a billion rand hole, probably is quite small, but 30 billion rand goes a long way, I think, if you're looking at leverage as well. So I think there's definitely a capability to invest, make further acquisitions, and obviously invest further in portfolio companies as well, which I think positions the industry quite well for the next few months, potentially years. I think we've also picked up some sectors that are of interest. And again, we're going to see your niche players picking up opportunities in these times, probably in every sector. But there's definitely a focus on health, food, education, and in general, companies that have already had a focus on your ESG and your sustainable development goals. If companies that are aligned to that, I think now and going forward will be very attractive for investment. And again, it doesn't mean right now. It also means when I talk about the recovery, we are talking about infrastructure spend taking place, rebuilding taking place, renewable energy projects, etc. I think we'll see a lot more focus on your ESG type companies, your impact investment type companies being high on the list for attracting funding. And again, it's purely from the sustainability, this long-term view again. I also think there's room for your investors and they'll have to, I think, adjust their risk matrix a bit, obviously still looking after returns, but there has been, as we saw with banks as well, there has been a review of what was our investment criteria, what returns are we looking for, and adjustments to that to see, well, we can still actually, in these times and over the next 2 years, still disperse money in a responsible way, but let go of potentially the criteria we had before and make some adjustments to that. So I see a very active investment community, and this is from an institutional investment point of view as well, coming out. But again, it doesn't mean that everybody will raise money, but I think the fact is that there is money out there, which obviously helps a lot when you start looking forward and we talk about a recovery and a growth plan. And that's really where they can't act alone. We need government, private sector, institutional investors, private equity to all work together and be on the same page around where we actually go.
Great. I think for me, I've just been surprised at how much money seems to still be out there. You know, when people were coming forward with donations for the government itself. So I'm hoping we'll still be surprised by other money out there. Seraj, do you want to add to this and maybe also mention what can the public do? And looking at SMEs, how can we invest, if I can call that, if I can say inverted commas, to assist and, you know, make our donation to the world, if I can call it that.
Yeah, again, I think for me the biggest donation you can do right now is to spend, is to use and spend money with your local supplier. We're going to need that money to flow. I think Jason is 100% correct in that. You know, when people think about investment, they often think of the TV shows Dragon's Den or Shark Tank or something like that. They think that you go there, you do your little tap dance, and someone drops R1 million and goes, bam, I'll give you R1 million. What they don't realize is that there's this due diligence process that then takes weeks afterwards, and often those deals that are done on TV don't actually happen because the due diligence didn't stack up. And all it's going to do is it's going to slow down the process, because due diligence, and this is again one of those interesting insights in that this kind of engagement that we're doing right now and having Zoom meetings are really good, and we're realizing how little we need to travel to still do work. However, it can never make up for shaking someone's hand, eyeballing them, meeting them, getting the body language, seeing the infrastructure. So I think investment's going to be slow when it comes to that. But having said that, I think there's always going to be money available. You know, we often think there isn't money available in the investment side of things, in the venture capital or anything else. But if your idea is good, there's a sizable market and you've got access to that, and there's a solid business plan behind the idea. It's not just an idea. There will be money for you, and people will invest in you. We know we had a question that came through yesterday already. Someone had emailed it from Tanzania, actually, Shamez Suderji. Sorry, I probably just butchered your name. But they were asking about when is a good time to start thinking about starting a new business. And the answer of that is always, it's never the best time to start the business, and it's always the best time to start a business simultaneously. So start your business, you know. And I think if there's a definite need, and remember that it's not just an idea that is being created, because if you look at the apps in the app store, there's a million apps. It's the graveyard of clever ideas. Someone thinks, I've got an idea for an app, and they just develop an app, but there isn't a business behind it. We need to get people to come up with really solid businesses now that satisfies the needs of a sizable market. Then it's a good time to start it right now. People are, your cost base is going to be a lot lower. There's a lot more deals available that you can do, you know. I think general, the public, again, can they invest right now? You know, if they weren't in that place of investing in businesses anyway, now is probably not the time that they're going to try it out, even though they're probably going to be able to get a good deal out there. But maybe it's investing in an established business that needs some cash flow now, because that's one way for a small business to get cash flow. They've got an established business, they've got an order book, but they don't have the cash. And if that business now goes out and gets a small investor and gives away a little bit of equity with an idea to claw it back in future, that's a way to get more money in. And for someone sitting with a bit of money, that's a way of investing a little bit in as well.
Great, thank you, Seraj. That's very helpful. And I think, again, we have to rethink things. You know, we really have to take stock and rethink of how we're going to do things in the future. But what I'm also hearing is, you know, the basics aren't necessarily wrong. So thinking about the basics, doing a business the way that we've been taught to do it, it's not necessarily wrong. So we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But maybe just on a final one or two questions, Jason, is there any trends that you've seen that have developed, that have come to the fore due to the pandemic and the impact and reactions?
I think there's quite a few that I think is interesting to take note of. I think one is already we're waiting for government to re-announce the new budget. And I think that's going to be an important place for us to link a lot of planning to, because once we know what that looks like, and I think we have a view, but once we know what that looks like, we can start bolting on a lot of other things around that from a private sector, from an investor point of view. I think also your DFIs and your foreign direct investment have a big role to play now and going forward in some sort of rebuild. And I think they're already very active on the continent, and I think they're very well positioned to take a leading role in rebuilding. And then that links up with, if you're looking at co-investment, I think co-investment will also be a trend coming through, where you've got DFIs, government DFIs taking the lead on various projects and co-investing with private investors, which might be the big pension funds, but with private investors to manage that risk a bit. But that's where we're really going to see, I think, infrastructure and that type of growth investment taking place over the next probably 3 to 10 years to really rebuild South Africa. I think one of the things also that's important for me is we talk about this how interconnected we are from a globe. And I think from an Africa point of view, we also have to understand we're not a country alone. We're obviously on the continent. So I think we probably have already, if you look at the various trade agreements already in place, we need to relook at those and say, well, how can we leverage that probably better than before and use that to position ourselves better for a globe recovery? And if you look at things like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and I know their meeting now 1 July got postponed, although it's already in effect, but that uniting the continent as one trading bloc, that's almost 3 trillion rands worth of trade, and 1.2 billion people. That's a very powerful position to come from. So I think there's an opportunity for us in this to position South Africa, but Africa as something very serious to contend with going forward. But we have to obviously make it attractive that it doesn't make it difficult for international business to trade with us, because obviously we're not the only emerging economy. People can easily look towards Asia, to India, to China to also trade with. But again, I think if you're looking for another silver lining, it's in our power to do that. We've got the base now, we can reset. We've got the ability to design and have some control of where we are going forward. I think also what we have seen, or a thing I've picked up, I think we talk about, I think as in Africa already, we've got a pretty strong civil society. And I think we've seen that develop probably over the last 30, 40 years. We've seen that, I think, take a lot of form over the last 3, 4 years. And I think it's interesting for me from a local and from a global perspective is, are we going to see consumers change the view of themselves and see themselves more as citizens? And I think that's an interesting point or thing that I'm debating, is how are we as a society going to emerge from this? I think also, I mentioned already your ESG and your SDGs. I think that has been forced onto the forefront of debate now, because we now see what the impact of a global event can be. We also see that what happens in Africa or America or Europe isn't isolated from anything, which means the underdevelopedness of the African continent is something that will affect the globe one day as well. So I think if there's inequality in one area, it does spill over time. Given enough time, it will impact. So I think we'll be interested to also see how we emerge from this, and how does the climate change debate change once we've now come out of this. I think also historically we've seen companies focus on efficiencies a lot, and we've all done it, where the whole just-in-time stock system, there's financing structures developed around this and logistics around this to manage your processes as effectively as possible. But we've also now seen the flip side of what that means if you don't hold X amount of stock locally, if you don't have a big enough cash buffer, etc. So I think there's a big emergence going forward, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. But the focus will now be on how robust, how resilient your business is, as opposed to how efficient it is, which obviously will affect returns, but that's short-term returns. We want long-term returns. So I think that whole image or whole debate around long-term focus and sustainability becomes so much more relevant now than we have seen in the past. And I think also maybe just to sort of close off, another loose point I saw, which one of the private equity guys shared with me, was that they've got a sort of a 4-point thing they look at, where for them to focus when they're looking at their businesses. Firstly, they're focusing on the employees, then they're focusing on customers, then suppliers, and then financials. So I think, again, that just reiterates where the focus should be, how important that focus on supply chain is and your sustainability. But again, it just shows you again, the people first, employees, then customers, then make sure your suppliers are okay if you can help. And that includes your SMEs and informal sector. And then you get to your financial viability.
Thanks, Jason. I think that was quite a helpful suggestion towards the end. It is about people, and this is a thing that affects people, I think, in the end. Seraj, any comments or final comments from your side around SMEs and sort of the entrepreneur? Is there any trends that you're picking up, any advice or things that you're noticing? How can we go about these things?
I think, yeah, it's a lot of what Jason says. I mean, I agree with everything he's actually said, not a lot of it, all of it. And I think from a small SME perspective, one extra thing I'd say is that this whole idea of co-opetition, where you cooperate with your opposition is a thing that existed before this, where the term co-opetition, it's fairly new, but it's really taken to a fore in that how can you work with your opposition? And it's amazing how when we were spiraling out a little bit into, we were talking about it's a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, but it's also such an opportunity for being human to step forward. And for us to say, does it always have to be win-lose? Or can we start looking at some kind of way of a win-win with your opposition? Is there a way of going, I've got material, but you've got the clients. Can we somehow work together we'll dust off our gloves again and fight on an even scale in a few months' time. But right now, how can we work together? So I think the competition side of things is a trend that I think we need to see more of, not only in small business, but in bigger business as well. I think there's, there's an opportunity right now when it comes to, can you form partnerships with different people? Partnerships, as Jason said, so there's mergers, but can you partner if an SME is really about to close down and about to die, but it's still a viable product in the good times? Can you partner with your suppliers? Can they become a partner? Because if you die, they lose someone in their value chain. So can you partner with your supplier? Can you create an employment share scheme where you can't pay your employees right now, but I'm going to give you some shares so that you're still getting something out of this? There's those type of things. Can you trade and barter? Are we going all the way back to, hey, I do these, but I don't have any money, but can I trade with you and you can help me with something? So I think taking it back to those kind of things and leaving us with that fundamental thing of it's a human crisis that is impacting us on multiple levels, which means that the thing we have to be most after this is human, and just how we deal with the poor, how we deal with our own resources, how we deal with our staff and those around us.
I think interesting what you mentioned there, because I also think about, we touched on the informal sector earlier. I think one of the big retailers mentioned or noted that they're thinking of entering the spaza shop game. So for me, the reaction could also be, well, instead of opening up your own spaza shops, if you're in any case setting up the logistics to deliver into that network, well, you can, instead of setting up your own stores, you can deliver to the existing network that is there and use your buying power, etc. So I think it's those type of things. I'm not going to mention who, that it's in the press, but it's those type of discussions that I think corporates, individuals should be having in around, I can still survive, but I can be the wholesaler, and the informal sector now potentially formalizes a bit, but gets the benefit of a much slicker supply chain, probably a much more reliable supply chain. And I can just imagine the knock-on effect from that. But it means that everybody survives and not just one. That type of debate, sorry that I'm using them now as an example, but there's a few of those examples that I think is important for us to have, especially when you're talking about SMEs, especially when you're talking about your informal sector. And I think in South Africa, we're lucky to a degree in that, and I mentioned the social society earlier. If I look at the enterprise development and supply development initiatives and procurement within corporates already there, if you look at those, the economic impact of that, what that can be used for, I think those themes coming through there, a lot of that can be applied now, because ultimately it does come down to economic upliftment and assistance. So I think, again, we've got a lot of things in South Africa going for us from a governance point of view, from a sustainability point of view, and also from some initiative we've already implemented from a supply chain point of view, which we can probably leverage and I think be probably a world-class example for how things can actually be done in a very skewed society.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think, again, what you've made me realize is that this is a complex situation, that it seems that I pendle from freaking out and getting very anxious to maybe this is some good stuff coming out of this. Maybe South Africa can get out of trouble. So I think that's unfortunately the way things will be going forward until we really get out of the pandemic itself. So if you're open to it, I'm going to open the floor to any burning questions. We do have about 10 or 15 minutes. So if anybody wants to be brave enough to raise your virtual hand, again, like I told you, you can just go at the bottom of your screen. There should be a menu that pops up. Manage participants. There's a raise hand function. If you press that, I can see on my screen your name and that the hand is raised, and then I can allow you to ask your question to the speaker directly. So let's see, is anybody brave enough to ask a question or make a comment? Because as you've said, this is a human issue. So as humans, we need to put our brains together and find ways of getting through this? So far, no one is brave enough, from what I can see. Are there any other final? Oh, okay, there we go. We've got two jumping up. So Theo Alkema, if you don't mind, I'm going to unmute you, and you're welcome to ask your question. Theo?
Thank you very much. One of the things that we've seen in corporate is the extremely quick adjustment to working from home and enabling digital connection and all of those kind of things. Maybe just a comment on how you think these things will become business as usual, or is there, after the crisis is closed, whenever that will be, you know, are people just going back to sitting 2 hours in traffic instead of having their meetings on Teams or Zoom or whatever the case may be? So how much of the adaptability that we see play out in companies currently will become business as usual when we see things becoming whatever the new normal will be like?
I think it's an interesting one, that I think it takes a very short time, I think, for habits to be instilled. So I think there'll be a habit already from the employee's point of view that this is something new and we're very familiar with how this can work. So I think there's something of that will definitely stay and probably develop further. I also think that we've now proven that for your managers who struggle to adapt, that staff can be trusted. School kids can be trusted to do work from home, although we've seen some of the hacks they also apply. So I think there is definitely going to be a trend for that. I think if I have to ever drive to the office again and sit in traffic, forget it. I'm going to be using Zoom, and then we will see, I think, that develop even further. I think the reality is, though, within an area like South Africa, cost of data is still a massive issue. Access to electricity is still an issue. Access to the internet, etc., is still a problem. So I think there's a lot of companies, obviously, who don't have the luxury of being able to work from home, whether it's SMEs or the informal sector. So yes, I think at let's call it the upper end, if you want to mention it, I think there will be a big change. But I think the reality of our economy and how it's structured, there is still a big physical part to it. But again, that also translates, if you look at sort of your fast food change, many more people have become comfortable now with, or will become comfortable with, ordering online or phoning in and having it delivered. But it still means that buying behavior doesn't mean that we're going to have the same sales before, or we might. And how does that affect sit-down restaurants? So I think there's a few trends here that will stay with us, but I think there's also a few that, if companies don't change, will obviously not benefit them.
I mean, it's interesting that you know, people have had digital strategies, corporates and businesses, drawn up for a while, and we will implement this someday, and we're going to do it slowly, and we're going to do that. Along comes COVID-19, and wham, they need to have it up. It really has fast forwarded a lot of companies' digital strategies that they would have done anyway, and it's just brought it very quickly. I think I recently saw that Telkom and Vodacom are kind of increasing the bandwidth and holding prices the same, and just to kind of make the working from home a little bit easier. What will be interesting is how they go and choke that again, going backwards. I think there is a new norm. I think there is I will Zoom instead of fly to Johannesburg for that one meeting. You know, we got comfortable with flying up for a single day up and down. Do you really have to do that? But I think the one thing you cannot also discount, because we may be romanticizing this working from home right now, because yes, it's practical and I cannot sit in traffic, but we know about the spark that happens when you're around a table with 4 people that are in that space, and things are just kind of working off each other. There's something special about that. And I do feel that there will be some going back to that, in that we want to have that human interaction. And I think there are strengths from having those personal interactions again. But but you know, this was an example of just this leadership. We were chatting to you guys, the organizers as well on this, and that when we ran these in person, where everyone came and I think the size was kind of like 100 people. Today we've had up to 300 people online at the same time, and I think the 800 people signed up. But I think the system could only handle 300 because it never went over 301. But there's something that just goes, we used to do it in person and it's really great. Can we do it now like this? And maybe there's the hybrid that becomes the real thing, which is we still have the digital so that the guys who can't drive in to be in person can still be involved, but we have the physical because there's some joys. And I think that kind of, in the same way that people that are getting the digital strategy right for retail, everyone thinks a digital strategy for retail is shop online, but it's about how can digital enhance my experience when I'm in the store. That's the real thing, is how does it work together? And I think that's where the new norm is going to become really exciting, is where you start putting these two together and going, that lockdown was like this pre-lockdown, but what is it together? Where's the synergies in this?
Great, thank you. If I can ask Bongumusa, if I'm saying your name's badly, I apologize, but you're welcome to unmute yourself and pose your question.
All right, thank you very much. Look, I want just to make two comments, if it's possible. I think the challenge we are in is presented as interesting things that you need to consider. One of them is that for those of us in a particular age group, particular generation, we are faced with the issue of changing how we manage and lead the organization where we are in. Because some of us are used that you can only be effective and productive solely because you come to the office, I see you, you arrived, you entered, you are on your desk. Now, I have to accept I don't need to manage people, but I need to manage their productivity and how they advance their company goals and also deliver on the outputs. That's one part. So the combination of the kind of a hybrid of coming still to office but also be able to work wherever you want is now more than just a necessity, especially with also the generation that we are having now, the Generation Z. That is also coming into a workplace. That's one part. But the other part that I also see this COVID situation challenging us is the issue of partnering for success. One of your panelists indicated that in a business, you are actively involved in managing your business. So there is no much time sometimes of stepping out and see it on a base view where we are going, what you need to cut, what you need to introduce. But if you are working with partners, academia, other entrepreneurs, other businesses, and on all stakeholders, then that's where you are able then to leverage and see other opportunities and where also you need to cut. I think that's what it calls for. Partnering for success, understanding that your success depends on the number of other people around you and number of other organizations around you, and then calls for the understanding of the complexity and the systems thinking approach, which sometimes is hard to see the interaction of different parts in one system to achieve a particular goal. Thank you very much.
I think you touched on an interesting point there around I'm going to sort of latch onto one of your points around this always being connected. With staff now being able to work from home, and most people then that can, with teams being remote, it also becomes very interesting. We talk about this work-life balance, and does that exist? Is it even possible? And then if you say, well, yes, it is, or no, it isn't, and we talk about I'm always on, how do we then manage that? So I think there's a lot of things which I think has been there, has been debated, but we're now living that. And I think over the next 2 years, 3 years, we're going to see a lot of things develop out of that. But again, we're going to have a lot of probably human problems coming to the fore as well, because of the nature of how we're operating. I think also I've at least seen that the globe has shrunk for me a lot, with a lot of things internationally we're doing, dialing into sessions like this, for example, where time zones become interesting to manage as well. So the fact that I'm working between 8 and 5, but I'm dialing into a call at 12 in the evening because that's when you New Yorkers on, how do I start managing that? And is there the understanding and the empathy that I can't do that? Or is it okay that I'm sitting in front of my computer here now and then a child runs in, which I've seen happen on Bloomberg a couple of times. So I think that side becomes an interesting one to debate about how you manage your teams and what we expect from them and how we connect to each other with the understanding also that there's obviously a private life as well.
Yeah, and I think on Bongo Musa's point, when it comes to managing people remotely, I think the important thing to remember as well is that the responsibility of the success of this is shared. And if you as an employee is going to abuse that, then it's going to fall away, and people are just going to start pulling people right back into working in an office. I mean, I think sitting in traffic is one of the worst wastes of your time that you can do. So if we can somehow create that efficiency and allow for better efficiency, it'll be great. I think there's going to be certain industries that will allow that. I know that I saw a recent post where a call center set up 555 people working from their homes within 3 weeks. They're all set up working from home. The question really has to go, do they need to come back? And I think certain jobs will totally be okay with, look, I still get monitored on how many calls I take and it's all related, I can stay here. And then there's others where it's just not going to work. I must admit, there was, when was it, 2 years ago, a year ago, with a guy on the BBC and his kids ran in and his wife came to drag them out. I think there's a far better, if my kid had come and climb on, I think everyone on this call would be totally appreciate that, and it's fine because we're all living it. And so that's become the new norm, is that it's totally fine if your kid jumps on there, because we've all lived through that. And then last point on a very light note is that, anyone who ever asked, what do stay-at-home moms do? Really kind of, that's a kind of a wake-up call, and it's kind of, that's what you do all the time. Yeah, it's much harder than you think. It's much harder than you think.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, it definitely is harder. This homeschooling thing is fighting me big time. So next up, Lydia Amatenya. Sorry, I'm bad with saying names. I've also got a strange name. If you don't mind asking your question. Lydia?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Well, I do entirely agree that this time of uncertainty calls for extraordinary innovations for all of us to keep up front. However, I also believe that managing in a crisis, as many of you have indicated, is very difficult, but more so that the future is really uncertain, like this time of the pandemic spread of COVID-19. So I think in terms of leadership of companies is really being tested, and perhaps the tertiary institutions like the USB might need to really strengthen their risk management approaches when it comes to their curriculum, because this is the time that we really need to adopt to new changes of new ways of doing things, even after COVID-19. And the business world will definitely never be the same again in so many different ways. So I think this type of discussion is really taking place at an appropriate time, that we are kind of not thinking ahead of what is likely to happen should the situation get worse than it is now, but also to start thinking the way we have been doing things. It has been, some of the organization has been static. If you are not at work from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock, people don't think you are at work, even if you are making your contribution from wherever you are. So we need really to adapt to this type of changes. And I think it's a wake-up call for everyone that is involved, from the corporate world. So even the small businesses, they are coming forced to come up with better, innovative ways on how to operate. So I think we all going to learn something from this pandemic, and it's really going to reshape the way we believe, or the way we do things, and the way we believe things should be done.
Lydia, I mean, your point is so true. I think there's a lot of reality checks which has hit everybody corporates, individuals, and obviously government. I think, and our purpose mentioned earlier, the governance. And I find, as with many things that's regulated, or in this case, guidelines, things become a tick box exercise. But I think this has now proven to us how important a risk matrix, how important it is to make your risk matrix as wide as possible, and risk management, how important that actually is for organization, and that it is actually something that's alive, that's interactive. And this crisis now, and I know from a leadership point of view, we're probably managing this like the approach is almost warlike to it, and there should be a return to sort of some normal management post this. But the reality is, with how we're feeding things through now, where we are being blindsided, this will definitely change how we approach anything going forward. I think we've also seen, I talk about the risk management, but you also see with how companies are looking forward, how they're planning. We talk about and I won't go into the detail, but we talk about the difference between scenario planning and contingency planning. There's fundamental differences in how these things actually interrelate. So if someone's now doing a budget or a forecast, and someone says, well, do a scenario plan for me and do a contingency plan for me, I think many companies use it as the same term. But there's fundamental differences in how we look to the future and how we plan. And I think a lot of things we've been shocked into reality about how we need to look at that. So I agree with you that this is a time for us to one, learn how to work better, learn how to be better. And we have the opportunity now to, I guess, build a better future. So again, probably the third silver lining is that we're in the corner now, and we can move forward from this.
If I may also come in there, Jason, from the USB's point of view, it's currently the only business school that has an Institute for Futures research. So I think a lot of people aren't aware of that, and we're just realizing more and more how important it is to do futures thinking. And as you said, scenario planning, and how important it is to actually imagine these possibilities so that we don't get caught off guard as we have been.
But I think just on that point, I think the interesting thing for me is people talk about this event as a black swan event. The point is, there's movies about this on Netflix right now. Bill Gates has been talking about this for years. We knew about this. If you talk to any company, most of them would have has a crisis plan in place or disaster plan in place. The country has one in place. We've looked at pandemics. We just realized that we were completely unprepared. Firstly, from identifying how severe it is, and then obviously then putting the right appropriate action in place. So I think it makes us really look at that about even if we have plans in place, is it enough?
Absolutely. So if I can move on to the next one, and Nell Forer, and Nell, if you were very welcome to ask your question and unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi there. You guys said that. You guys said that we need to digitally enhance our stores. So if you in the retail industry, you need to digitally enhance a retail store. But how does one do that? How does one go about that? And especially for a convenience center with like a petrol station, all of that combination. How does one digitally enhance that?
I think obviously I know exactly what you're talking about. So if I look at your business, I think there was a question yesterday also that someone sent through around quick service restaurants. So I'm going to kind of combine that into this answer. I think there is certain businesses, obviously, that isn't as easy to pivot or to change. But if I think about a fuel site, there's fuel you're selling, there's a convenience store, there's fast food you're selling. Some sites also having fast food with sit down. Now, if you look at that combination, you're probably very well positioned in that you've got cars driving past, not interacting with many people. You might pivot or might change to having self-service, like we see in European countries already, or America already, as opposed to individuals helping you put in fuel. So there already is something which, with social distancing, starts coming into play. If I look at the fast food side of the business, the takeaway part of it, we probably will see takeaway still taking place, probably seeing less sit down happening. You'll probably see more people eating in their cars, as an example, and not taking it away to their houses, but actually sitting in their cars, maybe. Now, that's very possible for someone with a quick service restaurant in a strip mall or outside. If you're sitting in a mall somewhere, it's going to be very difficult because people are actually going there to potentially sit down. So I think there's those type of nuances that does play in. But again, that also depends on, I think, how quickly potentially we start opening up, how quickly we get a vaccine, if we ever do. I think there's elements, though, in this pandemic we're dealing with that we are stating things and planning based on our wishful thinking. So we are talking about a vaccine coming forward in the next 12 months. Well, what if that doesn't happen? What if it takes 5 years? What if this gets worse? How do we then plan? But I think if I look at a fuel side, I think that's actually very flexible, because you've got people coming to you still to fill up fuel. Interaction is quite low. And there is sort of tweaks you can actually do, I think, to probably still keep all your businesses open. I think very difficult in this environment, in that people, obviously, you can only deliver. People can't come, they can't stand in queue for food. But again, where does that line draw? If they order the food and you then deliver it to them in their car sitting outside, maybe that's something possible. Very difficult, I think, for a restaurant, for example, who's sitting in an environment where they need they're a fine dining restaurant, they need sit-down people. Are they now going to halve the tables and triple the price? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, just my bit into that as well. It's not one of those things we can answer on the spot. Now, I think it needs to be considered. But the main criteria, the thing that I really want to say is, just don't think of it as binary. Don't think of it, it's like we're online or we are in store. Just think of how the two work together. And I think Jason's point of kind of, if you're at the service station, can something ping on your phone, order something, it gets brought to you. You've now cut out the need to go and stand in a queue. And that type of thing is a small area. I had mentioned the fact that within retail, it's not even a COVID-19 kind of fix. It's a general kind of fix where I remember I was working for MWeb many years ago, like when the internet just came out and they started talking about smartphones and the convergence, and it was stuff that was blowing my mind, where it came to, the fact that your fridge is eventually going to order the milk yourself, So as you entering milk, the doorbell will ring and someone will come to you and say, you need milk. And you don't even know that, but your fridge ordered it by itself. So it's kind of those type of things where we don't even think about it, but how can walking through the store, what is the online experience really good at? And what is the retail space really good at? And can you combine the two? So the retail gets you the feeling side of things, and the online gets you the choice so quickly. So how does that, can your phone help you increase that experience? That's as an overall kind of thing on that.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. I've noticed the time is at 2:30, and I see there are some people that are needing to go and saying goodbye. So I'm going to call it quits there. There are some more questions, but I'm sure they can pop an email to USB and they can post it onto you, and we can take it from there. If I may ask, before you disappear, if you can just do the final poll for us to know what you thought of today's session. We are doing a series like this, so the next one will be advertised and positioned everywhere on social media, in your mailbox. So please do join us. A big thank you to Jason and Seraj for joining us today and for your time and your input. We realize that this is not an easy question and an easy answer. But again, I think if we are human and truly human with a generous spirit, we can pull through this in very interesting and eloquent and creative ways. So thank you very much for your time. We appreciate the effort, and we wish you well. Stay safe even through the lockdown, and take care of each other.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Also, sorry, the session will be available, and the recording will be available. So please have a look on all social media sites. It should be on the YouTube channel soon.